The night did not begin with silence. It began with a storm, not the gentle kind that rattles softly at windows and soothes restless minds into uneasy sleep, but a storm that felt as though it carried intent. The first rumble of thunder rolled across the blackened sky like something alive, shaking through the walls of every home in the valley. The lights flickered once, then steadied, but the air in the rooms had already changed. Shadows felt heavier, drawn closer to the floor as if waiting for something unseen to arrive. Thunderstorms have always been more than weather. They are reminders of the fragility of walls and windows, of how easily nature can strip a sense of safety away. Some claim storms unearth things hidden in the mind. Others believe storms disturb more than memory and soil. In countless places, people have whispered of what storms bring with them, of voices that do not belong, of faces in glass that vanish when seen directly, of figures standing in doorways during lightning strikes that fade back into the dark when the sky goes black again. This night was one of those storms. It had come suddenly, unannounced, in a way that felt unnatural. The air had been heavy the entire day, the horizon smeared with a gray haze that did not move. When the rain began, it was as if a curtain had been pulled down across the world. Sheets of water clung to every surface, bending trees low, hammering roofs, and swallowing all familiar sound until only thunder and the hiss of rain remained. In that noise, silence itself seemed to vanish, and with silence gone, one could no longer trust what they heard. Inside the homes scattered across the valley, families gathered in dimly lit living rooms, wrapped in blankets, whispering over the roar outside. The windows trembled, leaking water at the edges. The smell of damp earth and ozone pressed in from every direction. Children were told not to look outside, but children always look. Some pressed their faces to cold glass and swore they saw something more than storm outside. One child claimed a figure was standing under the lone oak tree, though the lightning revealed only its bent branches. Another swore there were faces in the streaks of rain themselves, blurred but watching. Parents shushed them, yet their own eyes betrayed doubt when the thunder cracked again, loud enough to shake the dishes in the cupboards. There is a strange truth about storms. They make time different. Hours stretch. Minutes hold their breath. Lightning breaks the world into pieces, each flash revealing a room, a street, a landscape as if it were a photograph. Between those flashes lies a darkness so complete that the mind begins to draw shapes within it. The longer the storm continues, the more fragile the barrier between imagination and what is real becomes. That barrier would be tested tonight. A sudden blackout swept through the valley as if someone had reached a hand across the horizon and snuffed every light at once. Televisions went dark, radios cut to static, and the hum of appliances stopped. For a moment, the only sound was rain. Then lightning returned, searing the outlines of every object into sharp clarity. The sofa, the window, the table, the blanket crumpled on the floor. Everything appeared familiar until one looked twice. Because in more than one home, it seemed as though something extra had been revealed in that brief strobe of light, something that was not there before the flash and not there after. A woman sitting alone on her couch swore she saw a shape at the far end of the room when the lightning cracked. She blinked and it was gone. A man across the road reported hearing the back door creak open even though it was locked. In another home, a child began crying, pointing at the corner of the living room where the shadows looked too thick, too heavy, as if something crouched just out of sight. The storm outside made every sound louder, every silence deeper. The storm outside made every room feel like a stage where something else had entered unseen. Storms have been called the perfect cover for things that move when no one is watching. Rain swallows footsteps. Thunder masks doors opening. Lightning blinds the eye with a burst so sharp that by the time it fades, one is no longer certain of what they saw. For those trapped inside, every clap of thunder felt like a warning. Every flicker of lightning felt like a reminder. Every dark interval in between stretched long enough for something to move closer if it wished to. Some say storms do not just cover, they reveal. They peel back the ordinary and allow glimpses of what lingers underneath. Old folklore from the region spoke of storms that carried voices of the lost, spirits searching for warmth, beings that drifted toward houses with lit windows. Neighbors had once told stories of hands tapping glass, of muddy prints on floors where no one had walked, of a feeling like breath on the back of the neck while sitting alone, waiting for thunder to pass. These stories had always been told with half a smile, but no one smiled on this night. This night felt too much like one of those stories, and no one wanted to admit it. Lightning split the sky again. The rooms filled with blinding white, and for a breathless second the world outside looked different. Shapes stood at the edge of trees. Shadows bent the wrong direction. Inside, the houses were still, but the stillness felt staged, like a silence waiting to be broken. The light faded and the darkness rushed back. The storm grew louder, angrier, as though aware of the fear it stirred. There are storms one forgets by morning, but there are also storms that mark themselves into memory, where the sound of rain is never just rain again, and thunder is never only thunder. This was one of those storms. It began with lightning, with flickering lights and trembling glass, with the weight of unseen eyes pressing in through every window. It began with the uneasy realization that no one inside truly believed they were alone, and in the valley below the raging clouds, the question whispered quietly across every silent room lingered like a wound. When the storm is loud enough to swallow every sound, how can anyone be sure of what else is moving in the dark? The valley had always been a place shaped by weather. It lay low between two ridges where winds funneled through and storms seemed to gather as if drawn by something unseen. Old maps marked it with little more than farmland and dirt roads, but those who lived there understood it differently. To them, it was a place where skies did not forgive, and where the air carried a heaviness that never truly lifted. They accepted it as part of life. Generations had grown up counting the seconds between lightning and thunder, measuring distance not in miles but in echoes. Yet even among the locals there were murmurs that storms here felt sharper, stranger, almost deliberate. Families in the valley told stories that their children half believed. Stories of ancestors who claimed that storms carried whispers, that rain spoke if one listened long enough, that thunder sometimes repeated words already spoken in the house. It was easier to treat these tales as folklore, harmless and entertaining, the kind of thing told during long winters when the wind howled at the eaves. But beneath the surface there was unease. These were not legends imported from elsewhere. They belonged to this soil, passed down with the same familiarity as farm tools or family recipes. The storms shaped people here, and not always in ways they could explain. The families who lived in this valley during the storm in question had been preparing for it without realizing. They were accustomed to boarding windows, keeping candles ready, stocking pantries with food that would last through outages. But none of those preparations addressed the other kind of darkness, the one that entered not when the lights failed, but when belief itself faltered. When power lines fell and radios went silent, the only barrier left between them and the unknown was faith that the walls would hold, that their homes were still their own. One such family lived in a modest white house near the edge of a gravel road, surrounded by fields now soaked and bending under sheets of rain. The father worked at the mill in town, the mother kept the home, and their two children were still young enough to be afraid of shadows in the corners of their room. The house had stood for over 60 years, built by the father's grandfather, its wooden bones strong but weathered. Its walls had absorbed decades of storms. The family believed it would protect them again, though on this night that belief began to fracture. From the moment the first thunder struck, the mother felt uneasy. She described later that the house seemed too quiet between the crashes, as if listening. The children had been put to bed early, though they woke repeatedly with each roar outside. The father tried to remain calm, lighting oil lamps when the electricity cut out, his expression betraying little. But when lightning illuminated the windows, his eyes drifted toward the dark yard with more focus than he admitted. He said nothing, but he kept the back door bolted twice. Not far from them, another household sat in silence. An elderly couple, both retired, lived in a home at the foot of the ridge. Their children had long since moved away, leaving them alone in the storms they once shared as a family. The wife insisted she heard something walking outside the porch, its pace unsteady, its pauses deliberate. The husband dismissed it as branches bending in the wind, but he did not open the door to confirm. Instead, he sat in his chair by the window, staring out at nothing, waiting for the lightning to return. Later, he admitted that he too believed something had been pacing outside, though he refused to say it aloud while the storm raged. The community itself was small. Neighbors knew one another, trusted one another, and in calmer times gathered for meals and church meetings. But when storms came, the bonds of trust shifted. People shut their curtains tight, locked their doors early, and endured in silence. If something was outside, no one wanted to know. If something appeared at a window, no one wanted to admit it. What happened behind each set of walls stayed there, because the fear that spread across the valley during storms was too fragile to share without breaking. folklore blended with memory in ways that blurred truth. There were stories of a storm decades ago when a man vanished from his home during a blackout, never to be found. Another told of a woman who swore she saw her dead husband standing outside the window during lightning, his face pale, his eyes empty. She collapsed from shock and never recovered her mind fully. In the telling of these stories, people shook their heads, smiled thinly, and reminded each other that storms often confuse the senses. Yet the same people crossed themselves or whispered prayers when thunder rolled across the valley again. This is the context in which the night unfolded, a place where storms were not just weather, but history repeating itself, a place where fear was not spoken of in daylight, but carved into the silence of every house when the sky darkened. The families here had lived with storms all their lives, but this storm was different. It was longer, heavier, and filled with a presence that even those who denied the old stories could feel. By the time lightning lit up the windows and shadows bent strangely across living rooms, the community already carried the weight of generations of whispered warnings. The stage was set. The houses stood as fragile islands in a sea of blackness, each window a trembling barrier, each door a thin wall against whatever pressed close in the dark. The families waited in silence, and the storm did not let them forget what lingered outside. Something had been waiting too, and on this night it would remind them. The storm deepened as the night advanced, and with each passing hour it seemed less like weather and more like siege. Rain no longer fell in drops, but in sheets so heavy that the outside world blurred into a wall of water. The trees at the edge of fields bent nearly in half, their branches thrashing like figures struggling in the wind. Lightning painted the valley in stark flashes, each burst revealing a landscape distorted and unfamiliar, as though the storm remade the ground every time it opened the sky. Between those bursts lay a darkness so absolute that the families within their homes felt suspended, unsure whether the night outside had an end at all. It was during those intervals of darkness that the first unsettling details began to emerge. In one house, the mother noticed that the front door, which she had locked herself, now stood slightly ajar. Rain blew inside in thin sprays, dampening the rug. She closed it firmly, slid the bolt across, and told herself that the wood had swollen with moisture, that the lock had slipped loose in the shifting frame. She did not mention it to her husband, but her hands trembled as she wiped the water away. Across the gravel road, another family sat huddled in the living room, speaking in low tones to distract the children. A sudden clap of thunder rattled the window so violently that one of the panes cracked, a jagged line running from corner to corner. As lightning illuminated the room, one of the children gasped, swearing they had seen someone standing on the porch through the broken glass. The adults dismissed it as imagination, but when the father rose to check, he hesitated before drawing back the curtain. The porch was empty, soaked in rain. Still, he slid the chain across the door and lit another lamp. The elderly couple at the base of the ridge listened as the sound outside shifted. Rain hammered the roof, but beneath it was something else. A steady rhythm, footsteps. They moved along the side of the house, paused at the back wall, then shifted again. The husband tried to rationalize it as loose shingles or water pooling in the gutters, but the sound was too deliberate. When lightning flashed, the wife thought she saw a shape move past the kitchen window, dark and upright. She told herself it had been a shadow thrown by a tree, but the certainty in her chest told her otherwise. In the valley's center, one of the largest houses stood dark after the power failed. Inside, the family used candles arranged carefully around the living room. The flickering glow seemed to bend the walls inward, each shadow stretching unnaturally long. As the storm raged, one of the candles extinguished itself, though no breeze had touched it. A child whimpered. When the father leaned forward to relight it, he found the wick wet, as though someone had dipped it in water. He stared at it for long moments before lighting it again. No one spoke of it, but everyone noticed the silence that followed. The hours crawled. With every crash of thunder, each family began to notice details that unsettled them in ways they could not fully explain. A chair slightly out of place, a set of keys no longer on the table where they had been left, a door that resisted opening, as though something pressed against it from the other side. These were small things, but together they began to erode the fragile belief that the storm was only weather. Neighbors would later report glimpses of movement where none should have been. A figure seen briefly through curtains standing still in the yard before vanishing with the next flash of lightning. Wet footprints tracked across a kitchen floor where no one had walked. The faint sound of breathing near the stairs when the entire family was gathered in one room. These fragments of experience never aligned into one clear account, but each household carried their own piece of the same unease. As the storm worsened, contradictions multiplied. One house lost power while another across the road still glowed with faint light. A dog chained outside barked furiously for nearly an hour before falling silent. When the owner went to check, the chain lay on the ground, empty, though no collar remained. In another home, the telephone rang once, though lines had already been cut by the storm. When the father lifted the receiver, there was nothing but static, and beneath it something that sounded like whispering. It was during these moments that fear began to spread through the valley in silence. Not spoken aloud, not shouted across rain-soaked fields, but carried within each house like a private burden. The storm outside was undeniable, but it was what the storm seemed to carry within it that pressed hardest against their hearts. The question rose in every mind, though none dared to voice it. If the storm had drawn something into the valley, what was keeping it out of their homes now? Time stretched. The night felt endless. With each flicker of lightning, the rooms themselves seemed to shift, familiar spaces bending into unfamiliar shapes. The sofa became a silhouette of something hunched. The curtains in the corner suggested a figure watching. The simple act of blinking became dangerous, because in the space between light and dark, something might step closer. By the middle of the night, when the rain reached its fiercest and thunder rolled without pause, the valley no longer felt like a place on any map. It had become its own world, isolated, drowning in shadow. Every house a fragile island holding terrified families together. No one left their doors. No one braved the storm. And as the hours pressed forward, more and more began to feel the certainty that they were not enduring the night alone. What had begun as a storm was changing. It was not simply tearing at rooftops or shaking windows. It was moving through their lives, entering their rooms, rearranging small details, whispering at the edges of silence. Whatever it was, it wanted to be known. And before the storm would end, it would make itself known. By the time dawn threatened the horizon, the valley carried a silence that was not relief, but exhaustion. The storm had passed, leaving broken branches across the roads, flooded ditches and mud caked on every doorstep. Yet the rain-soaked ground and bent trees were not the only evidence of what the night had carried with it. Each household held its own fragments of a larger puzzle, details that might have been dismissed as imagination had they not echoed one another with unnerving precision. Testimonies emerged quietly. No one wanted to be the first to speak. People waited, watching neighbors with the same wary suspicion one reserves for the injured, wondering who had suffered worse. When the stories began to circulate, they did so in hushed voices over fences in the corners of stores, whispered in church pews where silence usually reigned. The similarities could not be ignored. One woman admitted that she had seen a figure inside her living room during a lightning strike. It had been tall, faceless in the flash, standing near the far wall as if it had always belonged there. When darkness returned, it vanished. She had not moved for minutes afterward, too afraid to even breathe. She found her courage only when her child began to cry upstairs. Later, she discovered muddy footprints on the kitchen floor. They trailed to the back door and ended abruptly at the threshold. The door remained locked. Another man described hearing voices through the static of his dead radio. At first, it was indistinct, like fragments of conversation carried from far away. But then it grew sharper, clearer, until he was certain he heard his own name spoken. The voice that spoke it was calm, familiar even, yet it came from no one in the room. When he turned the dial, the voices ceased, but a faint sound of breathing remained until he pulled the plug entirely from the wall. The cord lay on the floor, disconnected, yet he swore he could still hear the faint hum of presence long after. Children provided the most unsettling accounts, their honesty too raw to ignore. A boy insisted that during the storm, he had seen someone crouching near his bed, watching him while his parents remained downstairs. He claimed that the figure had no eyes, only a face like smeared glass, shifting and trembling as though it struggled to stay formed. A girl in another home drew with crayons the following morning. Her picture showed a window, rain streaking down the glass, and outside the shape of a head pressed close, mouth open in a silent scream. Her parents stared at the drawing, recognizing their own window down to the detail of the curtains. Fragments of physical evidence supported the testimonies in ways that deepened the unease. A blanket torn down the middle, though no one remembered touching it. A window latch bent outward, as if pulled from the outside by unseen force. Pieces of glass found in hallways, though no window had shattered. Most disturbing of all were the footprints. Several homes reported them, wet, human-like, yet not fully defined. They appeared in places no rain should have reached, across carpets, inside kitchens, near staircases. Some ended suddenly, the water evaporating into nothing. Others seemed to lead toward locked doors but stopped before crossing them, as though the threshold itself had been an invisible barrier. Theories began to surface, some grounded in reason, others drifting into shadow. Experts later suggested that storms disorient the mind, amplifying fear, tricking the senses into weaving illusions. The constant roar of rain can distort hearing. The flicker of lightning can confuse sight, making familiar shapes uncanny. Blackouts strip away the reassuring background hum of modern life, leaving people alone with their own thoughts. Psychologists argued that the valley's history of folklore primed its residents to interpret natural events as supernatural intrusions. Fear is contagious, and in a storm's grip it spreads without resistance. Yet these explanations faltered in the face of certain contradictions. How could illusions leave footprints that soaked into rugs? How could mass hysteria explain the simultaneous reports of similar sightings across multiple households, each isolated in their own fear? How could voices emerge from a radio that had no electricity flowing through it? These were not tricks of the mind. These were events that left behind residue, physical marks, emotional scars that could not be dismissed by science alone. In the aftermath, some families attempted to rationalize, clinging to explanations that steadied them. Perhaps intruders had taken advantage of the storm, prowlers moving through the darkness under cover of thunder. Perhaps animals had wandered into houses through doors left open in panic. But the details resisted such simplifications. No animal walked upright through kitchens without leaving paw prints. No intruder vanished the instant lightning faded. No human stood faceless and still in the corner of a child's bedroom without, leaving behind something more tangible than fear. Others embraced the darker possibility that the storm had carried something into the valley, not in the way rain carries water, but in the way silence carries meaning. That during the blackouts, during the moments when the valley was cut off from the rest of the world, something crossed over. It did not need to break down doors or smash windows. It slipped in with the darkness itself, inhabiting corners, pressing against glass, breathing in rooms where no one should have been. Evidence remained scattered, like fragments of a story torn apart and left for others to piece together. No single account provided a full picture, but together they suggested intrusion. Together they suggested that on this night the valley had been visited. What lingered was not proof, not conclusion, but possibility, raw and unsettling. Each testimony, each footprint, each whisper on the air served as a reminder that storms can do more than shake the walls of a house. They can tear at the walls of reality itself. And if this was true, if the storm had indeed opened something that should have remained closed, then the question pressed heavily upon every survivor. What had come through, and had it left when the storm ended? Morning light revealed a valley that looked almost ordinary. The storm had torn branches from trees, scattered debris across roads, and left the fields drowned in shallow pools. The ground smelled of wet earth, the air sharp with the trace of ozone. For anyone passing through, it would have seemed like any other storm's aftermath. But for those who had endured the night, nothing about it felt ordinary. What had shaken them did not remain outside with the broken branches. It had entered their homes and rooted itself in their minds. The families did not speak of relief when dawn came. They spoke of survival, as though they had made it through something larger than a storm. They moved carefully that morning, their gestures slower, their voices low. Parents checked doors and windows again and again, as if expecting to find them ajar once more. Lamps were left burning even in daylight. Children clung to their parents without needing to be told, their faces pale, their eyes fixed on shadows that no longer moved, yet still seemed alive. The first sign of deeper damage was sleep. No one in the valley rested easily in the nights that followed. Families left lights burning until sunrise, their homes glowing faintly in the distance like lanterns in fog. The sound of rain, once a familiar rhythm, now brought silence to living rooms. Mothers hushed children away from windows. Fathers lingered near doors long after locking them. A single drop hitting the roof was enough to wake some with a start, hearts pounding as though the storm had returned. Dreams came too, vivid and unrelenting. Dreams of figures in corners, of voices beneath thunder, of houses that opened their doors on their own. Children bore the weight differently. They began to draw more often, filling pages with images that unsettled their parents. Dark houses under rain, windows with faces pressed against them, black shapes leaning in through doors. When asked, they spoke simply as though repeating fact. This is what had visited them. Parents tried to dismiss it as imagination, but the drawings kept coming, sharper each time. One child refused to sleep in his room, insisting that the corner near his dresser still held someone crouched, waiting. Another would not let her mother close the curtains, claiming that if she did, something outside would press against them, trying to look in. Adults carried their own scars, though they hid them beneath quiet words. The father who had found wet footprints across his kitchen floor refused to enter it at night without carrying a lamp. The elderly couple who had heard pacing outside their home never sat by their windows again. The woman who had seen a faceless figure in her living room covered every mirror in her house, convinced that reflections could not be trusted. It was not only memory but paranoia, an erosion of trust in the very walls around them. Their homes no longer felt safe, and without that safety, their sense of the world fractured. The community itself began to shift. Neighbors who once greeted each other easily now spoke cautiously, searching for signs of shared experience before daring to admit their own. Conversations trailed off when others approached. Rumors spread faster than truth, stories twisting into half-believed legends before the week had ended. Some claimed that more than one person had vanished in the storm, though no missing names were ever confirmed. Others whispered that the valley had always been marked, that storms only revealed what lived here. Fear grew into ritual. Locks were checked not once but 3 times each night. Some families nailed boards over basement doors or sealed attic hatches they had never thought twice about before. Children were scolded not for lying, but for looking out windows when lightning flashed. Radios were kept unplugged, as if silence could block out voices that had slipped through once. Even on clear nights when stars burned sharp and bright, the valley felt watched. The storm had passed, but its presence lingered like breath on the back of the neck. The psychological toll deepened in ways no one wanted to admit. Anxiety took root in the community, a quiet corrosion of ordinary life. People jumped at sudden noises, startled at the slam of a door, stared too long at patches of shadow. More than one child developed fevers with no clear cause, their bodies trembling as they whispered of things moving in the corners of their rooms. Adults began to speak in terms of endurance rather than comfort. Days were endured. Nights were survived. The balance between living and waiting collapsed into one. There was grief too, though no bodies had been lost. It was grief for certainty, grief for trust. The trust that walls could keep things out, that storms were only storms, that the night ended when dawn returned. Those beliefs were gone. They had been stripped away, leaving behind the raw awareness that something had intruded. Whether it had come from outside or from within, none could say. But once known, it could not be forgotten. Perhaps most haunting was the silence that filled the valley when storms returned. The first rainfall weeks later was light, but it froze every household in place. Curtains were drawn tight, radios unplugged, lights burning long into morning. Thunder rolled faintly across the horizon, and though it never reached the valley's center, some swore they still saw shapes at the edges of their vision, standing at tree lines, leaning against fences, waiting. The storm need not be violent to be feared. It only needed to remind them. The valley had changed. Its people had changed. What had once been folklore was now memory, and memory is harder to bury. The emotional wounds did not heal. They hardened, shaping behavior, reshaping lives. Children grew into silence. Adults carried shadows in their eyes. The storm had ended, but it had not left. It lived now inside them, moving through their days as unseen as it had moved through their homes that night. And the worst fear of all was not what they had seen, or what they had heard, or what they had felt breathing close in the dark. The worst fear was what none of them could answer. If something had entered with the storm, had it ever truly gone back out again? When the first whispers of what had occurred during the storm began to take shape, the valley turned to explanations. It is human nature to seek order, to press chaos into the shape of reason. The families who had endured that night wanted answers, even if those answers came in the form of denial. Yet what followed was not clarity. It was a tangle of theories, investigations, and quiet speculation that only deepened the unease. Authorities arrived days later, not because of a crime, but because of the persistence of rumor. Too many families were speaking in fragments that overlapped. Too many details seemed to repeat. Deputies walked the muddy roads, visited homes, and listened to hesitant testimonies. They noted the footprints on floors, the bent latches, the cracked panes of glass. They took photographs where evidence still remained. Yet as they assembled their reports, the framework fell apart. Nothing suggested forced entry. No sign of prowlers or strangers lingered in the valley. What was left was only contradiction, scattered across ordinary houses that bore extraordinary fear. The first official theory was intruders. Storms can cover many crimes. Heavy rain erases tracks, thunder swallows footsteps, lightning distracts the eye. Perhaps a group of people had moved through the valley that night, testing doors, creeping into homes. But this theory faltered quickly. The valley was not a place that outsiders stumbled into easily. Roads washed out, bridges flooded, and no vehicle tracks were found leading in or out. The families themselves dismissed the idea outright. They had lived long enough in their community to know the difference between a person moving through their homes and something else. What they described had not moved like any intruder. It had not behaved like anything human. The second theory leaned on psychology. Storms disorient, blackouts strip away the comfort of technology, leaving silence that amplifies fear. Sleep deprivation twists memory, and generations raised on folklore inherit visions more easily than others. Experts claim that what the valley experienced was collective suggestion, a form of mass hysteria triggered by fear and reinforced by coincidence. This explanation satisfied some. It was cleaner, safer, easier to repeat. But again, contradictions resisted. Children who had never heard the old stories drew the same faceless figures. Families who had not spoken to one another described identical sounds, identical voices. And still there remained the matter of physical evidence. Footprints where none should exist, blankets torn without cause, candles extinguished as though submerged in water. Psychology could not unravel those threads. The third theory reached deeper into folklore and the realm of the paranormal. Paranormal investigators arrived, drawn by the growing whispers of something unexplainable. They brought equipment, cameras, and devices meant to measure shifts in temperature, electromagnetic pulses, sounds too faint for the human ear. They walked the homes where testimonies had been given, standing in corners where children swore they had seen figures crouching. They placed recorders on kitchen tables, left cameras pointed at windows streaked by rain. What they collected was inconclusive yet strange. In one recording, faint breathing could be heard beneath silence. In another, a voice murmured a word that no one could agree upon, its syllables indistinct, its tone low and deliberate. A camera left on during a test shut off abruptly, its battery drained though it had been fully charged moments before. None of this could prove anything. But for the families who listened, it felt like confirmation of what they had already lived. Whispers spread of older tragedies tied to storms in the valley. A man who disappeared decades earlier during a blackout, his body never found. A girl who drowned in a flooded ditch, though she had been seen standing near her porch moments before. Each story resurfaced, reshaped by the new fear. It was as though the storm had not been a single event but part of a longer chain, a pattern reaching back through time. The valley was not simply unlucky in weather. It was marked. Some turned to older beliefs for explanation. They spoke of storms as doorways, thresholds between worlds. Thunder was not only sound but warning. Lightning did not merely illuminate but revealed. The rain itself was said to carry voices, the weight of the dead pressing close. These theories spread quietly, not in public but in whispers among those who already believed. They were dismissed by officials, ignored by experts, but they held a power that reason could not dismantle. Because in their hearts, many of the families knew that these theories fit closer to what they had lived than anything offered by science. And yet, the storm resisted every attempt to define it. It left no clear trail, no proof that could be cataloged, no evidence that could be archived with certainty. What it left behind was possibility, and possibility is more dangerous than proof. Proof can be answered. Possibility lingers. It gnaws at silence, reshapes memories, and settles into the mind where it cannot be removed. In the end, no investigation closed the matter. Reports were filed, notes taken, evidence stored in boxes that gathered dust. The official explanation settled on atmospheric conditions, stress responses, and imagination fueled by folklore. But the families who had endured it did not believe. They carried the weight of their own eyes, their own ears, their own fear. They carried the certainty that something had entered their homes during the storm, and that no report could erase it. Theories continue to circle the valley like echoes. Some insist it was human intrusion, carefully orchestrated. Others maintain it was a psychological event, hysteria amplified by weather. Still others whisper of something older, something that walked in with the thunder and waited in the dark corners until the rain ended. None of these theories fully satisfy. Each leaves questions unanswered, details unexplained. And that is perhaps the most unsettling truth of all, that what happened that night does not fit neatly into any explanation, because it was never meant to. For the valley, theories offered no peace. They were only layers placed over wounds that still bled beneath. Whether official, psychological, or supernatural, none changed the fact that the storm had broken something fragile. None changed the fact that doors once believed to protect had proven useless. None changed the fact that storms would come again. And when they did, no theory, no investigation, no explanation would silence the memory of what had already moved in the dark. The storm ended, but its echo never did. Long after the roads dried and the ditches drained, long after the branches were cleared from the fields, the valley carried a silence that no one trusted. It was not the natural quiet of dawn or the steady calm of clear skies. It was a silence that seemed to watch. People noticed it most at night when the lamps were low and the world beyond their curtains stretched into darkness. They noticed it in the stillness after the rain, in the way the air pressed close as though listening for something that had not yet returned. Stories began to take shape, not because anyone wanted them to, but because they could not stop themselves. Memory works that way. It feeds on silence, reshapes itself until it hardens into narrative. Neighbors spoke of the storm in pieces, recounting what they had seen, what they had heard, what they had felt. The fragments never fit together cleanly. They shifted depending on who told them, like a puzzle with too many missing pieces, yet all of them ended in the same way, with uncertainty. With the unanswered question of whether the storm had carried something into the valley, and whether it had left when the thunder rolled away. Time passed, but fear did not recede. Families who had endured the night carried it within them, like a weight pressing on the chest. Some left the valley entirely, abandoning homes that had sheltered generations. They sold their land quickly, cheaply, desperate to put distance between themselves and the memory of that night. Others stayed but changed their lives around the silence. Windows remained shuttered. Doors were reinforced with new locks. Some households refused to light candles again, remembering how one had gone out in a room with no wind. Others slept in shifts as though they could keep watch against something that returned only in darkness. The valley became a place marked not just by weather, but by suspicion. Outsiders heard whispers of what had happened, though never the full story. Travelers spoke of the community's unease, the way people stared too long at the horizon when clouds gathered, the way children glanced at windows as though expecting faces to appear behind the glass. Those who visited did not stay long. Those who stayed did not ask questions. It was easier to leave the valley in ignorance than to stay and inherit its silence. The storm carved itself into the collective memory of the place, but it also spread outward in ways no one anticipated. Relatives in distant towns heard the story secondhand. The details blurred, but the unease carried. Some swore they dreamed of the storm without ever having lived it. They described lightning revealing shapes in rooms they had never entered, shadows pressing against glass in houses they had never visited. Fear traveled with the stories, as if the storm had loosened something that could move not just through weather but through memory itself. In time, theories no longer mattered. Explanations lost their power. What endured was the question, the same one whispered during the blackouts, the same one that lingered with every rainfall after. What moves when thunder drowns all sound? What stands still in lightning and vanishes when it fades? What waits in corners where the dark feels heavier than it should? These questions hung in the valley like smoke, seeping into every story, every silence. They offered no comfort, no closure, only the reminder that not all storms pass. Some remain. Some settle into the soil, into the walls, into the memory of those who endured them. And the valley knew this truth. Storms would come again. They always do. Clouds would gather on the horizon. Rain would lash at windows and thunder would shake through walls. When it happened, every family would pause, listening. Every family would wonder if this was the storm that would bring something back. They would wonder if the figures still lingered at the edge of trees, if the voices still waited in the static, if the footprints might once again appear on floors that had been swept clean. Perhaps the most haunting realization was this: the families did not fear the storm itself anymore. They feared what the storm revealed. They feared the thinness of the barrier between their world and something else, something they could not name, something that slipped closer when the night was loud enough to hide its movements. They feared that storms were not visitors but doorways, and every doorway once opened remembers how to open again. The valley remains. The houses remain. The people too remain, though they live differently now. They know that when the wind rises and the sky splits with light, it is not just weather that passes overhead. It is memory. It is presence. It is the reminder that in the silence between thunder and rain, one can never be entirely sure of what is waiting in the dark. And perhaps that is why the story endures. Not because it offers answers, but because it refuses to. It lingers in the mind like the last echo of thunder, long after the sound has faded. It leaves a question that no one can silence, a question that waits for the next storm, the next flicker of lightning, the next moment when silence stretches too long. When thunder shakes the glass and the lights flicker once more, will you believe the room is truly empty? Or will you wonder, as they did, if something else has been waiting in the dark all along?